Hey World Civilizations, Mr. Lassiter with you, and in today's video we're going to be looking finally at East Asia, especially China and Japan in this age of imperialism. We've been promising it for a while, so let's not hold off anymore. Let's look at our video goals. So we want to know how Europeans interacted with China and Japan in the age of imperialism. We also are going to look at how China resists this imperialism and try to see what the results are. We're also going to see and compare how Japan responded to imperialism as well, and then hopefully compare and contrast the impact that industrialization and imperialism have on these two countries. A lot of vocabulary here, so make sure that you get it as we go through our presentation today. And we're going to start with China because this kind of comes first chronologically if we're thinking about imperialism. So let's think about what China was like before imperialism. And it's been a while since we've been there. So in the 1600s, a new dynasty comes about in China known as the Qing dynasty. It's spelled with a Q, pronounced Qing dynasty. It grows to basically the size of present-day China by 1800, which you can see in the map. They were very powerful for a time, and they promoted agriculture and new ways of farming. And because of this, they produced much more food, and the population of China actually doubles. But as we know, dynasties rise and fall, and so by the 1800s, the Qing dynasty had weakened quite a bit. Now, one of the reasons why they were weakening is because European countries had started to put pressure on China to trade. And the Qing dynasty had wanted to really restrict trade. In fact, they restricted to just one port city called Canton, and this was called the Canton system. If you wanted to trade with China, you came to this one city. But by restricting trade, China was also restricting outside ideas. They really didn't like anything coming from Europe. They especially didn't like Christianity getting into the country. And they also shunned really any other type of European education. What this meant was that they were not going to industrialize or modernize like other European countries were because they themselves just rejected all those ideas. They didn't like the idea of railroads or factories, anything along those lines. Or new farming techniques. So China is actually going to weaken because they're just going to become kind of stagnant and isolated. And this is going to be one of the reasons why China really struggles. So let's move on to kind of the biggest event that kind of kicks off imperialism in China. And those are the Opium Wars, and there are two of them. So first of all, the Qing dynasty really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to trade issues other than just basically making sure it stayed out. And so they really ignored the fact that the trade of a drug known as opium had become very widespread, especially from the British. So the British would grow opium in India or Bangladesh or Burma, and they would ship it to China and sell it. And it became very profitable for both England and even the United States. And it helped even finance some of their growth. Well, the Qing government really picks up on this around the 1830s and decides that opium is not good for the country. A lot of people are becoming addicted. It's being very destructive. And so they attempt to ban the trade or sale of opium in China. Well, the British don't take too kindly to this because the British were all about free trade and trading anything that they could. And so the Qing dynasty is faced with a choice. Let Britain import opium or fight a war. And so they begin what becomes known as the First Opium War, which lasts from about 1839 to 1842. But keep in mind that China has been very isolated and they haven't been very advanced because they have not really opened up to new ideas. And so the industrialized British army sends their ships in and just crushes the Chinese. The Qing army is devastated, and the British get a very favorable treaty known as the Treaty of Nanking, which gives them a lot of different privileges. For example, instead of one port, they get 5 ports now. Hong Kong became a British colony. They got low tariffs, meaning they had to pay very low taxes to trade. China had to pay a penalty of 21 million ounces of silver to Britain as punishment for this war. And Britain was given what's called most favored nation status, meaning that if any other treaties were signed with any country like the United States or France or Germany, then Britain would get the same deal that those countries got. Basically, what ends up happening is Britain opens the door and the European powers start flooding into China. And they open up ports of their own all around the coast of China in order to trade for their wonderful resources. There is a second Opium War that's fought, 1856 to 1860, over similar ideas and with similar results. So what were the full results? Well, ultimately spheres of influence, which you can see on this map. These are spheres of influence and treaty ports about the year 1900 in China. So basically, the port cities that a country controlled and the region around those port cities that they traded with became known as their sphere of influence, or the area where they had a lot of influence in China. Keeping in mind that China remained an independent country under the Qing dynasty, but it's going to be very weakened by this sphere of influence system. China is still going to be exporting manufactured goods, silk, porcelain, raw materials, importing manufactured goods rather, and merchants and Christian missionaries are going to flock to China. So Europe is going to start making a lot of money off of this once isolated nation. China does try to respond to this though. Remember, China is very much against outsiders in this time period. The Taiping Rebellion is one good example, and it's odd because it actually started by a guy who had learned a lot about Christianity. And he thought he was the brother of Jesus, and so he got a bunch of followers together and started rebelling against the Chinese government and against European influence in China. Also, they wanted to improve economic conditions, which they thought were very poor in the country. They actually are very successful for a time, and they actually take over a large city, the city of Nanjing, but they're ultimately defeated with a combination of Chinese and European forces. And this actually becomes one of the bloodiest wars of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, there's going to be another rebellion which fights against European influence. And that is the Boxer Rebellion. And this is actually supported by the Qing Empress. And she basically gives support to the Boxers, which is what the rebels were known as. And they all try to push European influence out of China once again. In this case, however, European powers all get together and work together to crush this Boxer Rebellion, and therefore have even more influence in China. So, again, China did all they could to reject European industrialism, reject these ideas, and force Europeans out. But because of their isolation, they simply were not powerful enough to do so. Now let's look at Japan. This is going to be a very different case. They're going to have a lot of similarities though, so try to identify them as we go through in the notes. First of all, if we look at Japan before imperialism, we see that it was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, and local lords really under that group had a lot of power. The system, though, was pretty fragmented. As you have a lot of different people in power, it made it difficult to face outside threats. Until the mid-1800s, too, Japan had tried to be basically isolationist. They wanted to minimize outside influence, and they traded very little with Europe. But they were a little different from China because even though they rejected Christianity coming into the country and some other things, they really liked the idea of education and possibly even industrialization. In fact, they welcomed the Dutch, and they called this European education Dutch learning. So when the United States sent a fleet of steam-powered warships to Japan in 1853 under the guy you see pictured here, Commodore Matthew Perry, with a letter from the President of the United States demanding that Japan open its ports to trade, the government said, okay, we don't want the same thing that's happening to China to happen to us. We don't want to be taken over completely. So in fact, we will trade with you, and we will take your industrial knowledge that comes along with trade and use that to our advantage. The Tokugawa shogunate, remember, was very fragmented though still, and so they were very weakened, and people who were disappointed that Japan had opened up their ports to trade with the United States and other European countries decided to rebel, and Japan falls into a civil war for a time, actually ending in the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate. But as a result of the overthrow of this, provincial lords, or this kind of oligarchy, this group of powerful men, they come together and they launch what becomes known as the Meiji Restoration. Basically, these new rulers of Japan were willing to change the way society was structured, willing to get rid of the feudal system in Japan, and they wanted to transform their country into a world-class industrial and military power. They saw what had happened in China, and they did not want the same thing to happen in Japan. So instead, they learned all this military technology. They learned the industrial technology from the United States and Britain and France. They learned science, and they took in engineering ideas. They even began to wear clothing styles of Western countries, and even began enjoying some of the same pastimes. Ultimately, the Japanese government, under the Meiji Restoration, encouraged and even funded this industrialization that was coming from Europe, while still maintaining some of their most important traditions. As Japan industrializes, though, they also develop a very authoritarian monarchy, a very powerful monarchy that becomes pretty militaristic. They began even to think about expanding their own sphere of influence, because if you look here at this map, Japan is an island. So as it industrializes, just like Britain did, they need to go elsewhere for some of their resources, because an island can only support so much with its raw materials. And so they began to think of Korea and Manchuria and even other parts of China as areas where they could get these resources. In 1894, Japan actually goes to war in China and defeats them in order to get spheres of influence of their own in China. In 1905, they fight a war with Russia over influence in Manchuria, and they actually defeat the powerful Russians and gain a great deal of control over this region known as Manchuria. Also in 1910, they annex Korea. Basically, Japan has grown so powerful they can just take over the region of Korea. And so Japan in and of itself is going to become an imperial power, just like the European imperial powers, except they're based out of the Far East. This is going to become very important when we look at World War I, because Japan's going to take over some of Germany's lands, and then especially in World War II, as Japan invades China and begins spreading their empire throughout the Pacific. So now what we need to think about is how we compare these places, and that's what we're going to look at in class. Keep in mind that China resists Western influence and becomes weaker. Japan, which had resisted it for a time, instead transforms itself into a major industrial and military power. So we have to think about why this was, and a lot of times we can just think about the leaders of these countries. Chinese and Japanese elites really had different attitudes toward foreign cultures. Whereas China rejected this technology and were able to slow foreign intrusion, they also denied themselves the best way of fighting against it, which was a modern military. Whereas Japan instead embraces this technology and industry and therefore becomes a world power themselves. That's it for the video. Take a look at the goals. If you can't answer these questions, then you need to go back and watch again. Make sure you can identify these vocabulary terms and have a wonderful evening. See you in class.